Hagen and his men would be dead within an hour. The 73 Woldish soldiers that remained under Hagen's command had raised spear and shield with shouts of victory as the Albairs fled back down the hill. 100 wolds had reduced 160 clansmen to fewer than 50. Yet the beaten warriors did not retreat into the distance, and the wolds had fallen silent as another Albair warband had appeared from over the northern horizon to join with their defeated countrymen no more than half a mile away. The clouds that loomed above were black with the promise of rain, and only a dim light illuminated the landscape of moors, hills, mountains, and streams. Despite this, from his vantage point atop the hill, Hagen could see that the new arrivals were warriors from a different clan of Albairath. For where the repelled clansmen wore red tunics, those of the men reinforcing them were dark blue. They had undoubtedly heard of their countrymen's raid into the kingdom of Woldnor and been eager to earn their share of spoils. Hagen had once striven to learn about each of the clans in the hope that such knowledge could inform his tactics, but the ceaseless skirmishes against them had taught him all that he needed or cared to know, and at present, only one truth mattered. He and his men were now opposed by a force that looked to be 3 times their number. Soon, the Albair chieftains would lead their allied might across the wilderness to slaughter the remainder of the Woldish resistance. It had been that very morning that Hagen had been informed by his scouts that the Albair raiding party had crossed the northern border into Woldnor and into Hrothgar, the defence of which was his responsibility. Before rallying the men of his fort, he had dispatched those same scouts to the town of Merkton, a mile to the south, for there the alderman of the Shire made his home. They were to request reinforcements, though Hagen was uncertain of where such reinforcements might come from, except for a neighbouring shire. However, the Woldish crown did not consider the incessant Albair raids a significant threat, for the clans of Albairath acted independently, despite their king, and they made war with one another as much as with their neighbours. This made an organised invasion of Woldnor unlikely in their estimation. Besides that, the Woldish nobility were more concerned with the kingdom of Lurin to the west and the kingdom of Caelrin to the south, and understandably so, for their professional armies posed a threat to the very existence of Woldnor. Therefore, although Hagen's force was merely a fyrd, being mostly composed of inexperienced commoners that had been summoned for duty, it was deemed sufficient for repelling any incursions in the north. But the nobility were unaware of how tense the situation had become. For years the Albairs had crossed the border into Woldnor seeking riches, weapons, and slaves. But the repulsion of every such raiding party had meant the death of fathers, sons, brothers, and cousins, all of whose kinsmen would feel honour bound to avenge them. The common folk of Woldnor that were unfortunate enough to live close to the northern border had endured the worst of this burgeoning hatred. Rape and murder were inevitable in any conflict, but Hagen had seen evidence of torture among the burnt remains of many crofts and farms. Having consistently fought the Albairs for a decade, he knew well their capacity in warfare. They always engaged their enemies directly, and their warriors were poorly equipped, mostly wielding makeshift weapons, and they were almost always without armour. Conversely, the soldiers of Woldnor fought in formation, wielding spears and round shields, and they wore brown gambesons and iron helmets. Even so, the conflict was escalating and the clansmen were crossing the border in ever greater numbers and with an ever greater bloodlust. And so it had been with trepidation that Hagen had marched his men north to meet their old adversaries that morning. Having successfully tracked the raiders, he had positioned his soldiers at the edge of a steep hill and ordered them to form a shield wall. Now, the traditional Woldish shield wall consists of a single row of soldiers standing side by side with their shields overlapping. From behind the protection of those shields, men could thrust their spears. But Hagen had ordered his shield wall to consist of 2 rows, for he had found that their weapons were long enough for the men in the second row to effectively attack those assaulting the formation. Such a shield wall meant that the Woldish battle line did not extend as far as it might, which risked the formation being enveloped and flanked. But given their superior position and the relatively small disparity in numbers that day, he had felt comfortable employing such a tactic. As he had anticipated, when the Albair clansmen had caught sight of the Woldish force upon the hill, they had immediately moved to engage them. The disorganised mob of warriors had ascended the slope and assailed the wolds with spears, axes, and even crude tools such as pitchforks and hoes. They had endured a devastating loss of life doing so, but their relentlessness had been such that, by the time they had withdrawn to be joined by the newly arrived warband, a significant length of the Woldish shield wall had been reduced to a single line of soldiers. Many of those soldiers now silently searched the corpses that littered the edge of the hill, scavenging for weapons and armour to replace those that had been damaged. However, the fallen Albert clansmen bequeathed little, and so it was primarily their fallen companions that the Wolds were unceremoniously stripping of spears and shields. Dead Wold and Albert alike reeked of open bowels and an assortment of other grotesque injuries, and despite the grim skies, there was no breeze to cleanse the air. Hagen also walked among the dead, and as he went, the newer recruits looked to him. He knew that they wanted him to give them some reassurance, to tell them that their situation was not as dire as it might appear, or that their requested reinforcements would certainly arrive soon. But he would give them no such comfort, nor even turn to meet their gaze. Perhaps that made him a poor commander. Perhaps a superior leader would inspire them with a poetic speech, so that they might at least die with full hearts. But they knew their duty, they knew how to perform it, and they knew what the outcome would be. What peace they were able to find with that was their own affair. His eyes fell on a young Albert who lay backwards upon the hill's slope, his head in the direction of its base. Blood had flown from a gash in his throat and pooled there. The young clansman had charged Hagen with a hatchet raised, but had delayed in striking. In response, Hagen had swept his blade, likely the only sword on the battlefield, through the air and through his opponent's windpipe. The Albert had stumbled to a stop, dropping his weapon and clutching his throat with both hands, his eyes wide and conveying that familiar concoction of disbelief, terror, and pleading. Looking at him now, Hagen could see that the boy was too young to even have facial hair. He had no doubt been brought to the fight with talk of proving his manhood and the glory of battle. Similar sentiments had consoled Hagen when he had been called from his family home in his 18th year. His father had died of disease many years earlier, and so it had fallen upon the young Wold to secure his family's meagre land by answering his alderman's call to arms. He had eventually risen to the position of commander, more due to attrition than merit, Hagen having become the most experienced soldier remaining at his fort. And he had been given a brown cloak indicating his new status. Yet he was still able to recall how he had trembled uncontrollably upon being led to battle for the first time. Only bluster evoked with songs and war cries had proved capable of quelling that overbearing rush, or at least of disguising it. The Albert boy would have found his courage in the same way. But a willingness to maim and kill wins more fights than bluster, and such a willingness can only be instilled through experience. And so where the young Albert had hesitated to strike, Hagen had dealt his death blow instinctively, absent the degree of consideration required to even allow for hesitation. Would that readiness and ability to kill be the totality of his legacy? Had that been his only contribution to life? Regardless, his strike had ended whatever ambitions the Albert had harboured, just as Hagen's own would soon be rendered unfulfilled. He would never return to his home or find a wife that could bear his children, nor would he ever travel the continent as he had dreamed of doing since childhood. Yet both he and the Albert boy had been obliged to perform a duty, and while the boy's had ended, Hagen was required to fulfill his for a little longer. It was not more complicated than that. Having seen even babes and infants mercilessly slaughtered or taken by sickness and disease, his conscience would not allow him any degree of self-pity. A man was fortunate indeed if he lived long enough to even engage in such reflection. His soldiers having taken what they could find, they began pushing the Albert corpses down the hill and dragging the Woldish bodies far behind their former position so that they would not prove to be obstacles in the coming fight. Hagen did the like with the young clansman, sending him tumbling about 15 feet with a firm push of his right boot. At least the boy's kinsman would reclaim his body after the battle and bury it with dignity, a courtesy the Woldish soldiers would not receive. Several calls went up from among the Wolds, and Hagen turned to see that the Albert clansmen were approaching, the men of the different clans now mingled together. The Woldish soldiers needed no command. They began to reform their shield wall at the edge of the hill, this time in the traditional single line. Hagen issued no order to the contrary, for it would make little difference against such numbers, and he once again positioned himself in the middle of the formation. To his left and right he heard whispered prayers, some for salvation in battle and others for salvation in the afterlife, but he would offer no such prayer himself. The Albears that opposed them worshipped the same god and would undoubtedly also be petitioning him. It was unlikely that the outcome of the engagement would be decided by which side did so the most fervently. As for judgment in the hereafter, why should he have to persuade an all-knowing God of his good intentions or ask him to reconsider what must be his perfect judgment? If he was destined to be condemned in the afterlife, there was nothing to be done about it. The Albears reached the base of the hill, and Hagen could soon make out individual faces among them. Time seemed to move faster as they made their ascent. Thunder echoed across the land and heavy rain began to fall. Many of his soldiers would undoubtedly be interpreting it as God's attempt to hinder the Albears in their climb. The commander could only mark how much more intimidating they looked with their tunics soaked. The dark blue turned black and the red made crimson. Their warriors charged the Woldish line with a unified cry, and Hagen ducked behind his shield and braced himself. An impact caused him to slide several feet backwards in the muck, and he nearly lost his footing. The Albears had evidently decided to throw the weight of their bodies against the shield wall in an attempt to push it apart. It was a courageous act for those first making contact, since their deaths were almost certain. Hagen for one began stabbing beyond his shield before his feet had even come to a stop. He did not need to see his opponents to know when his weapon had dealt a crippling or fatal strike, for plunging a sword through flesh to pierce organs or scrape bone generates a very distinct feeling in its grip. Something heavy struck his helmet and there was a sharp pain on the top of his head. If he had just incurred a serious injury, then he may not live long enough to know of it. He had seen men fight on ferociously for many minutes with fatal wounds, even with their skulls cracked open, before finally succumbing to the damage. Perhaps his own skull had just been similarly fractured, but there was no time to ponder the issue. He looked over the upper rim of his shield to see an Albear lift a mace behind his head, but before he could swing it forward, Hagen thrust his sword, piercing his assailant's right eye. The clansman had no time to even cry with pain before he collapsed to the ground, the Wold's blade evidently inflicting catastrophic damage to his brain. The Albear surged forth anew, the weight of men forcing the Woldish shield wall backwards once again. Clansmen were now pushing themselves between the Wolds, breaching their line. Hagen kicked one of them full in his gut, causing him to stumble flailing into his countrymen. The commander used the space this created to throw his shield and helmet aside. No armour would encumber his last movements or stifle his final breaths. Besides, he found the tinny sound of raindrops falling upon iron about his head to be highly irritating. Wielding his sword with both hands, Hagen swung it wildly at the raging clansmen that surged towards him, each stroke yielding a scream. Blade or spike would find his flesh eventually, but raw aggression was more likely to delay that inevitability than anything else. He was jerked to his left. The point of a pickaxe had become snagged in his gambeson, and its wielder was trying to pull it free. Hagen let himself be pulled by his attacker's next effort, ramming his sword halfway into the man's stomach, at such a central point that the blade had surely severed his spinal cord. With a practiced motion, the commander pushed the impaled clansman away with his left hand while pulling his weapon free with his right. Hagen began swinging his sword around so quickly that the world about him became a blur of faceless foes in crimson and black tunics. There was nothing beyond them. He might well have been the last Wold alive on the battlefield, but his breaths were increasingly laboured and his attacks were weakening as exhaustion gripped him. In mere minutes, he would be spent and at the mercy of the Albears. A serenity settled upon him, and he involuntarily smiled. As he staggered about now, lashing out at the nearest threat like a cornered animal acting on instinct alone, it was all suddenly and somehow so obvious. His life had been exactly what it was meant to have been, and it could have ended no more fittingly. All was well. There was a chorus of shouts. Hagen could not tell where it came from, but the Albears confronting him ceased their movements, causing him to likewise stop, his sword held high for another strike. Cries rose up among the clansmen, and one after another they began to flee in the direction that they had come from. Hagen turned to see a mass of Woldish soldiers charging the battlefield, at least 100 of them. Reinforcements had come. He lowered his sword and fell on his knees panting as his new allies rushed past him in pursuit of their mutual opponents. The battle was won.